The idea is first, perhaps setting some ground rules. The idea is that we have a panel discussion for which we have invited 4 distinguished panelists. The audience, of course, is also welcome to join in, but perhaps to make things as easy to manage as possible within the time frame of about 1 hour. I would suggest putting your questions in the chat box where we can pick them up. If it's really a long question, then of course we can ask you to unmute as well. One of the panelists will be speaking in German. If this is a language that you do not understand, interpretation has been made available. Just look for the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select English. There will be interpretation from German into English, not the other way around. Okay, I think these are the basic ground rules for our discussion. But let's first introduce each of the panelists. And I think it's best if they introduce themselves rather than that I do that for them. So could I ask each of you in turn, obviously, to unmute and briefly tell us what it is that you are doing, obviously, what organization you belong to, and what your main experience is with the crisis that we are going through right now. Let me start with Nina, perhaps.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nina Asotic. I've been working for Atlas, organization for civic integration, for a few months now. As part of Atlas, we have the public interpretation services for the city of Antwerp within Atlas. I am a language policy specialist within my organization, and I've also been training and coaching Ukrainian crisis interpreters for a while now. We've been doing this for about 2 months, and we have some interesting conclusions as well, but also challenges. So I'm looking forward to discussing these with all of you today.
Thank you, Nina. Katrijn?
Yeah, hello everybody. I am Katrijn Maryns. I am Associate Professor in the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Communication at Ghent University. I actually have a background in applied linguistics, sociolinguistics and ethnography, but I've mainly worked in the domain of language and social justice in asylum and migration encounters. And because multilingualism is an inherent ingredient of these encounters, this is how I came across all sorts of multilingual situations and solutions for that in my data, including the use of a shared language, but also the use of ad hoc forms of interpreting, family members interpreting, the use of Google Translate very much, and unfortunately in a minority of cases, use of professional interpreters. Now I'm talking about these settings that I've observed. So this is what triggered my interest in interpreting studies and all the challenges it poses, some of which will definitely be discussed here. I have to admit that I have not been recently involved in any of those emergency initiatives. So I'm very much looking forward to the experiences of my co-panelists. I do have some more modest forms of experience with the Ukrainian situation in projects that are ongoing, but especially in projects that will start up in September. So very much looking forward to the discussion and what I and also I'm sure the colleagues can learn from it.
Thank you, Katrijn. Then on to Pascal.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pascal Rillof, the head of the Public Service Interpreting and Training and Accreditation or Certification team or unit at the Flemish Agency for Integration. Well, what we do is we recruit candidates, we train them, we certify them if they pass the test, and we keep the register of public service interpreters for Flanders and Brussels.
Thank you, Pascal. And you also help to maintain somewhat of a gender balance in this panel. And then finally, Elvira.
Dankeschön. Hallo in die Runde. Mein Name ist Elvira Iannone. Ich selbst bin Dolmetscherin und Dolmetschtrainerin und bin heute hier für den BDÜ, den Bundesverband der Dolmetscher und Übersetzer aus Deutschland, wo ich seit 2018 im Bundesvorstand bin und dort zuständig für das Ressort Dolmetschen. Der BDÜ ist der größte Berufsverband in Deutschland und vertritt knapp 8000 Einzelmitglieder bundesweit.
Dankeschön. Let's then start our discussion. It's not really going to be a debate, I imagine, but rather an exchange of ideas and experiences. But perhaps looking back at the situation of the past couple of months, what do you think has been the most challenging aspect in terms of public service interpreting and translation provision for Ukrainian refugees? Nina, perhaps?
Well, I think the most challenging aspect has been the fact that there are very few certified Ukrainian public service interpreters. So we've been expecting a huge flow of demand, which has been pretty much under control, I must say, but it's not a realistic view. Because of the fact that we have no certified Ukrainian interpreters, we are not sure what the real demand is in the field. This is why we started training these crisis interpreters to be able to have an offer ready whenever the demand catches up on us. So far, it's been going well. We've been having 2 groups that we trained. The first group participated in April, the second one in May, and we see that we already have more crisis interpreters ready to start working. However, the second challenge is the fact that we can only use these interpreters, these crisis interpreters, in very simple administrative contexts, and that we know that the real complex therapeutical conversations, for example, will still follow, perhaps in the fall, perhaps even earlier, but they will follow. And we still don't have certified Ukrainian interpreters. So that is the main challenge for the moment, to bridge the gap between these 2 components.
Is there a way of trying to circumvent the problem or to address the problem? Because you're saying, okay, these crisis interpreters can be used to a very specific end, but not to the more complex issues. But if these more complex issues arise, what happens then?
I will leave the word to Pascal about that, because there is a sophisticated form of training that is a hybrid between crisis interpreting and actual certified public service interpreters. But I think Pascal can answer to this question. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Pascal.
Well, Nina, thank you, but I will try to answer the question. And I'm glad you think it's sophisticated. There's at least one of us in the field that finds it so. Like many problems, a crisis needs a multi-layered approach. You can't just, go in charge of certification in Flanders and Brussels or the north of Belgium, let's say, but you can't, make magic happen and all in a sudden have a set of certified interpreters for a specific language. To be more specific, for Ukrainian, which is a language which hardly ever outside or before the crisis has any demand, we have 2 certified interpreters. But the approach we take now is it's one huge experiment, in fact, that should be monitored. What we do is we approach the problem, if you will, by means of the following layers. We have 63 certified interpreters for Russian, and there was much debate about it, but proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we see that many of a large part of the demand for Ukrainian citizens, refugees, is solved through Russian interpreters, certified Russian interpreters. That's one of the layers. The second layer is a program we already had and that we have modified or adapted somewhat to the crisis situation, the crisis interpreters that Nina referred to. Their training is based on an earlier fact-based, research-based, together with the University of Ghent, research that we did on the impact or the possibility to use shortly trained interpreters. We call them language assistants. They get a 3-day training, but importantly, they can afterwards follow the training and certification program if they wish so. Thirdly, we have a fast lane. Our training is composed of 2 parts, a module 1 and a module 2. We have a fast lane in which we have intensified the module 1, then interpreters, and solely for Ukrainian in the crisis context, start to work, and in parallel they are further trained, and afterwards they can go to the module 2, etc. In Flanders, we have a social interpreting, public service interpreting register. Court interpreters pertain to another register that's due to the political context of Belgium. Court interpreters are federal, national matter. Social public service interpreters are regional political matter, policy matter. So we attract interpreters from that other register, but also from Holland, from the Rijksregister, the national register in Holland. We attract interpreters. We give them a training package and the possibility to further engage in exercises. And then, of course, we have our standard program as well. And all of that has added up to, at this point, 43, I'm looking at the numbers here, 43 interpreters that are active from the range from the crisis interpreters until the standard program interpreters, so the certified ones. Not included the Russian interpreters, 63. So 43 are active in Flanders and Brussels. 12 of them are in training. 18 are in a registration phase, which means they are trained but not yet in action. And we've accomplished that between the 21st March and now. All the interpreters, all language assistants or crisis interpreters that are not certified have the possibility and are urged to go to, as in the next phase, to the certification program.
Okay, this looks quite impressive. Perhaps one follow-up question before going to first Elvira and then Nina. How do you distinguish between these different programs in terms of PSIT provision? Is there some kind of gatekeeping in terms of selecting the right person for the right task, for the right assignment?
Yeah, so I go to Nina now. I think there is some kind of gatekeeping.
Okay, you're to and froing between the two. Okay, so first to Nina and then Elvira. Nina?
Well, as for gatekeeping, we have a minimal screening of candidates, considering the time rush and the importance of connecting interpreters to the right assignment. But as I said, the context is typically the same. So it's often very simple administrative context, where we try to use these interpreters mostly for social services centers. So of course we try to match the interpreters with the right working field, but considering the fact that the context is mostly the same, we have no choice but to send them off to have them work for several hours at these centers. And afterwards, we evaluate. So what we do is we coach, we evaluate, we try to keep track of the feedback of those that the interpreters worked with, mostly the caregivers. That's the specific form of gatekeeping that we do use. What I wanted to say earlier was also what is another challenge is the fact that these volunteers, these crisis interpreters, are often also people with family in Ukraine, dealing with their own problems at the moment, getting their own family over here. So what we see in our groups is that we have 10 participants, for instance, who enroll. And afterwards, we only have about 6 to 7 candidates that actually show up to the training. Mostly there is a second group, a second training, and then there are even less participants. And then by the time we get to the info session and the contract and all the specific, the very practical side of things, we see that there are even less participants that actually want to stay, that actually want to be called, to be used in these contexts, because they are dealing with their own problems and with their own family, and they just often lose interest, and it's not bad will, it's simply because of their own personal context. So that is a second challenge that I had to think of while Pascal was speaking.
Okay, thank you. Now on to Elvira. What is the professional interpreter's perspective on this? Because now we're seeing a huge range from a fully trained professional interpreter to crisis interpreters to all sorts of profiles in between. What is your take on this?
Ich muss erst noch mal einen Schritt zurückgehen.
Well, to be honest, I think we need to take one step back first, in that in Germany there's no comparable certification system. There are different opportunities to gain educational training in to different degrees, of course, up to pursuing studies, but I'm sure in many countries there aren't offers of this kind. But then there are, of course, these 3-day courses that you've mentioned, as Pascal has explained, that essentially serve to raise awareness of certain things. As regards the proportions, Russian interpreters from Ukraine, among our members, our numbers are fairly similar. This means there are quite few interpreters who are organized in that sense and that meet the quality requirements we'd have in mind compared to Russian interpreters or work with Russian as a working language. If we look at the numbers that Pascal mentioned and we apply that and round it up to the demand that is there, well, then it becomes apparent that the need for communication, and I say communication deliberately, that this need cannot be met. And so you have a certain situation, you have certain expectations and needs, and clearly you want a fully fledged, comprehensive, accurate interpreting service to enable communication. And there aren't enough interpreters to meet this need. And so from my perspective, from our perspective, it is absolutely crucial to determine between different types of communication situation. Is this the kind of situation where you have, say, standardized information that is passed along at, for instance, the first encounter? Or is this about things that pop up in everyday life, administrative issues? Or in turn, is this about going to the authorities to register? Is it a medical appointment? Or other conversations, perhaps such that have legal repercussions? And so there is a certain need to have different channels, if you like, and to bear this in mind when you're gatekeeping. But the question is, how can you really make that work? Because in Germany, without these structures of certification or systematic training courses as a blanket offering across the country, that becomes very difficult. And it becomes difficult to see in which areas in Germany what is happening. Who's responsible for what, where, who's doing what. And within the federal structures as well, we have observed, and I say once again, that each place, municipality, initiative is trying to find their own solution. And I'm saying, once again here, because it is a while back now, I think 2015 in quotation marks, if you like, but these are things that do repeat themselves. On the one hand, it's simply the way it goes when you're dealing with this kind of topic. The Ukrainian language up until the 23rd of February was in a different situation to now. And now, of course, this is a new situation for us. In Germany, now, on the other hand, since 2015, 2017, structures have been developed, namely interpreting pools at the municipality level, for instance, and different initiatives to help, but that have different requirements as regards who can be called upon under what circumstances. And so this is very much a mixed situation. We acknowledge that there is this great demand for communication. We also know that there are too few properly qualified people to enable this communication. And based on that, we do have to take a look and decide how we can attempt to channel and structure this communication.
Thank you very much. I think if we listen to the different contributions so far, we can see that we're all more or less on the same wavelength in terms of seeing a certain need and seeing different ways of trying to meet the need, but at the same time also seeing great disparity, great heterogeneity in terms of how these issues can be dealt with across Europe, even though we're all seeing the same needs and we're all seeing the same issues. So that then brings me to the question, what can be done to try and find some further, perhaps harmonization is too strong a word, but some form of a convergence between different practices across Europe. Is that something that the project that's about to start, Katrijn, can work towards?
Well, we hope that we can develop something that can improve, well, especially that we can encourage more collaboration between different partners, between different experts. And just to give you some context on the project, what we feel is that across Europe, there is still a huge inequality when it comes to access to services. And this inequality is to some extent caused by linguistic inequality. So, and also there are no equal standards when it comes to public service interpreting. And this is one of the aims of the project, that we develop a web portal where we can provide minimal standards for quality public service interpreting as a starting point, because a second thing, or a second objective of the project is that we want to anticipate, or try to anticipate, this mismatch between supply and demand. And this by developing or focusing more on video remote interpreting across national boundaries. And I do realize, as I'm saying this, that it raises several issues. For example, when it comes to target language, what target language do we use? Is it possible, is it desirable to use, for example, a global language like English or French or Arabic to solve certain urgent problems? I had a discussion with some colleagues from the Russian department who told me, like, okay, in the Ukrainian situation, apart from what has just been mentioned already, many people do speak Russian. Of course, there is the whole social political context and the many concerns on that front, but many of the people who arrive, for example, in our country, are highly educated, are very good speakers of English. And then the question is for urgent solutions, to what extent should we be, and not just we as in Belgium, but in many countries, be more flexible towards shared target languages? It's a question. I'm not providing answers, not yet, as I've said, a project still has to start, but I think this is something that definitely needs to be investigated. And then a third component is that we want to focus specifically on the languages the languages of the most vulnerable speakers, linguistically vulnerable speakers is what we call them. So people with low literacies, people of lesser diffused languages. And usually these languages go inside with the refugee languages. And that's why we want to empower migrants and refugees by training them as refugee public service interpreters. And here, of course, we can learn a lot from these recent initiatives. And that's why we're very happy that ENPSIT is one of the main partners. And Pascal will be involved. Also, Federziel will be involved, because we will work with residents from different centers across Europe. But there's so many challenges. We are aware of that, but we do believe that a first important step to take is that we have some sort of a solid ground to start from when it comes to the training, competence, accreditation, and so on, and that we can then take the next step. And I mean, there is so much going on already, but I think now we will have some opportunities to do it in a more systematic way. It's a 3-year project. Many stakeholders are involved. So we hope that we can bring all this expertise together.
This has been very good testing ground for the project over the past couple of months, apparently. Yeah. Yes. Elvira, you wanted to respond to this?
Ja, danke schön.
I wanted to address the point about the requirement for different languages and which languages are actually being used to communicate in. We also observe that certain conversations are working in English, they're being held in English, people who have come to Germany and communicating amongst one another here. I can't really quantify that, but I would say that more conversations seem to be happening in Russian. And this is due to the historical background in Germany as well. And those who had learnt Russian in Germany, even this is a while back now. And there are others who have a family background where Russian is spoken as well. Within this context, I'm just wondering about one other thing, the difference between supply and demand here. This has been touched upon, of course. The logics, really, of the fact that again and again we'll be in situations where from one day to the next there is huge demand for communication in a certain language that wasn't previously the case. I've already made the comparison over the past years. Of course, looking to the future too, this is valid. Even if we hope that it would not be the case, that there will be languages that aren't on our radar right now that will at some point become more in demand thanks to migratory flows, etc. Perhaps this is a relief in a way if we can answer the question as a whole, because this crisis situation is one that we are to encounter again and again in the future. So should we not have routines and structures to enable this to work, and perhaps approach this from a bit more of a long-term perspective as well? Can we not develop systems through which interpreters can be educated to meet certain quality standards, and so that we can insist on these standards to a certain degree? So this be certification, accreditation with homogeneous standards. I believe that the long-term goal is that. So I think those are two different things to look at, really. And the association, our association, really has this formulation, migrant in mind there, then being educated to become interpreters, so undergoing training. And this training function surely is also part of the integration of these people into the respective country, because that also is in connection with the financing of this as a service. And that then is in contrast to voluntary interpreting, people who happen to be in a person's network, they happen to know are there to help. And therefore, we'd be able to provide a framework within which interpreters would be remunerated as well. And so I see that as a question of integration, where you have just arriving at first, that is essentially the start, but then to see how this develops over time and to have these individuals pursue this as a profession over the long term.
Indeed, the long term is always most interesting to look at, but also most difficult to look at, obviously. What we're seeing today, perhaps, is, or that's the question that I could put to you, is it the start of changing attitudes and working towards changing frameworks? Because we've all started, or wherever there is some form of accreditation, there's always been a fairly strict system of accreditation. This is sometimes also what public service providers themselves demand, that you have a very strict framework, that, for instance, you cannot use a shared common language as a vehicular language. Does this crisis situation, does it open the door to greater flexibility? And of course, then the question remains, is this something that also in and of itself requires some form of checks and balances? Do we want this to happen in all sorts of situations? We've heard before, a number of you have mentioned, okay, it depends on the situation. If it's simple, if it's administrative, that's fine. Of course, something which looks simple from the outset might change into something completely more complex during the course of the conversation. How do you deal with that? Have people been trained for that, etc.? How do we deal with those kinds of issues? Elvira?
In diesem Zusammenhang bin ich froh, dass die ISO-Norm.
I'm delighted within this framework that there is an ISO standardization being revised, or has been revised recently, for the certification and making certification possible in Germany, at least. It's not clear yet how exactly this is supposed to work and who should put this into practice and all of these details, but on the other hand, you also need to have very clear framework conditions, because we see again and again that people are interested in gaining a certain qualification, in undergoing further training, but that they do not have perhaps the required finances, or over the course of the training, they have to go without financial income. And so longer term, people have to see training of this kind as a bit of an investment. And with this in mind, as a professional association, we work quite a lot with position papers to try and demarcate what this framework should look like. At the same time, there are other points that feed into this. And what I would like to pick up on of what Nina said earlier was that currently, this is a very laden topic in terms of emotions and what people are going through. essentially everyone who works with Russian or Ukraine among my interpreting colleagues have relatives or loved ones on site. And so when war broke out in February, March, they then had to stand by and watch how that developed, and therefore we require additional structures, and I would say that this would be in the form of supervision, systematic crisis intervention protocols, so that this could be applied to professional interpreters, but also non-professional interpreters who take on this role as interpreters. I'm not sure, perhaps, Nina, I know the topic is slightly different now, but perhaps you might say a little bit about how you deal with this.
Unfortunately, for the moment, we don't have an organized form of intervention or any kind of psychological support. For the moment, they only have me as their coach, as someone to share feedback with. But of course, I'm not a trained psychologist or any sorts, so that is quite difficult to pick up on this topic. But that is definitely something that I've flagged already. And this is something that we need budget for. The problem is you don't know how long this crisis is going to take. You have no idea what the long-term implications are for these crisis interpreters. They are dealing quite okay right now, but this is exactly because we are only using them in these simple administrative contexts. As soon as we make the decision, because of still a general lack of certified interpreters, that we will also use them in more complex therapeutical contexts, yes, then we will have to think about what kind of intervention we can offer these interpreters, what kind of psychological support. And that is something to take into account long-term, absolutely.
Perhaps, Pascal, is this something that should be taken into account in the standard certification training program? Because now it's really hit us all. We can all realize, because it's in our faces, what kinds of stories that interpreters need to deal with. Is this something that should be part and parcel of the training, or a follow-up training, lifelong learning, what have you?
Yes, exactly. You're talking about the Ukrainian crisis, but we're living from the view of PSI in a perpetual crisis. We're in a state of perpetual crisis or emergency. So my service will start with, at the end of this year, we will start with a package of post-certification programs, which will consist, be further developed next year, but we start this year. And there will be three components. One of them will be coping with the situation interpreters are in once they're certified. But indeed, as Elvira said, also the non-certified ones, since now we start to work with them, should be in scope as well. But anyway, in that post-certification program, that will be dealt with. So supervision, intervision, coping. Two, there's a technical aspect of interpreting itself. Chuchotage. Now in Flanders, public service interpreters are certified, work consecutively, but they will learn to work longer consecutively and also in parallel. And thirdly, there's the context, the working context in which they work, medical, the social, etc. Further specialization or develop further expertise into those fields. For example, we have a medical package, but they could further develop their know-how in oncology, for example. So those three dimensions will be included in our post-certification program, with which we will work together with those services that actually provide the interpreting services, like Atlas and a few others in Flanders and Brussels.
Okay, thank you. I can see that there's a question from the interpreter to mute your microphones if you're not talking. We'll try to do our best for that. By the way, speaking of the chat box, feel free, dear audience, to raise any questions or remarks that you may have, and we will put it to the panel as well, obviously. Yes, so post-certification is something which is rather new, and what is also new is the fact that coping is indeed a part of that, which is definitely going to help to take these interpreters to the next level. Has, to some extent, there also been some kind of attitude change on the side of the public service providers themselves? Have they become more aware of the challenges that these interpreters are dealing with and everything that they need to address? Or, on the other hand, has it become even more of an issue in terms of, okay, anyone can interpret, because we're seeing it now, we're not using certified interpreters, works fine, we can use a shared language, or we can use ad hoc interpreters that haven't even undergone some kind of crisis training? Or is that something that is very difficult to bring to the surface for us, because perhaps we don't know everything that's going on? It's an open question. Elvira?
Ich wollte jetzt nicht schon wieder als erstes antworten.
I didn't want to be too upfront about volunteering. Of course, if anybody else wishes to take the floor, feel free. From our perspective in Germany, what we observe is that this awareness among specialists for working with interpreters seems to be a little bit delayed, with a bit of a lag there. Going back to 2014, 2015, in Germany at the time, we had a huge increase from interpreting from Arabic and Afghan languages, and there were situations in which people were asked to help that weren't quite fit for purpose. Then, a little while later, we received the feedback that actually, this isn't working. We don't want to work with people who have no clue of what they're doing. We do want to have people be trained. And then there was a lag once again where people realized, oh, you know what? Actually, seeing as we conduct these conversations, perhaps we can also contribute to communication being successful. So I think these are different phases. Now, over the course of that, we had the impression, even if it's not necessarily systematic or quantifiable, we had the impression that it really depended a lot on the respective institution. What the attitude is there, what the overall mindset is vis-a-vis interpreting, or whether people think, oh, people can just learn German quickly and they can jump in after a few weeks. So there are great differences in experiences, but we are in part building on what happened during the last crisis.
Should more be done to educate public service providers? Katrijn? Is that something that your project will also be looking into?
Yeah, I think, well, to continue because you start from a crisis, it presses more for flexibility. It also makes it very tangible what the urgent needs are. But at the same time, and this is something that we've experienced from ongoing projects, and of course something that we will have to address in the future project, but that is that in situations of urgency and crisis, it's really difficult to implement something new, even if it is efficient. To give you an example, in a current project, we've developed sort of a semi-automated tool for the registration of asylum seekers in the arrival center. We've worked really hard on that. We had IT support. We have translation in over 20 languages, including Ukraine. So we've tried to really do what we could in a very short term. But the most challenging thing right now is to make sure that this tool is being used on the ground by the organizations, because they are overworked. They have to constantly have to deal with urgent situations, urgent problems, and even for something which is quite flexible to use and easy to use, there is no time for that, no energy maybe for that. And that's why I think, and this is what Elvira also said, we really need these routine structures. It's very hard to start up something new when you're in the middle of a crisis situation. So we need more routines that need more time to become a routine. It's not something that you can suddenly introduce. And it's quite frustrating, I have to admit, when you've been working hard on a particular tool and you see like, okay, the time is not right. It's just too early to really use it, even though it can be so efficient in the current situation. So I think we can also learn from that. And that the flexibility is a very good thing, but on the other hand, we need flexibility from all these different sides. So it should be some sort of a managed flexibility, if you like.
Mm-hmm. And before going to Nina, in trying to convince public service providers to indeed use such tools or go for harmonization of whatever kind, is this something that you can address by trying to convince the people with their boots on the ground, the people that really do all the work with the clients that we're aiming for, or is this something that should go higher up and then trickle down somehow, or both?
Well, I think both. So what we've tried to do is bottom up. So a researcher went to the center, asked all the employees to bring their computer so they could do a very hands-on workshop how to use the tool. They were really enthusiastic about it, but still in practice, there is no time even to, to start up the computer, the program. So we need both. There also has to be some, I believe, top-down, more structural approach where the tool is being promoted, where we develop tutorials, but of course we need, we can ask them to put them on a website, but there should be some continuation after a project is finished. And that's with these outcome targeted projects. This is often a problem that you develop something, but then once the project is over, who will take care of the continuation, the fact that it's still being used, updated, and so on. So that's something that we will definitely try to bear in mind with the future projects, that we have all the stakeholders on our side, and ENPSIT, of course.
And it's often more difficult to convince the top rather than the bottom to implement something, indeed. Nina, you wanted to respond.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to your question about the attitude change when it comes to public service providers. In Atlas, we see two challenges for the moment. First of all, we believe that public service interpreting is only an integrated part of a broader language policy and multiple language instruments which can be used. So it's not an island, it doesn't exist on its own, it's part of a larger scope. And we often organize trainings for public service providers about language policy, about language instruments, including public service interpreting. The problem right now is that there is no time. These trainings often take place once every 2 or 3 months, and it's part of an open offer, which is organized by Atlas several times a year. But right now, there is simply no time to train all the public service providers that actually work with crisis interpreters to raise awareness what the difference is between a trained certified interpreter as opposed to a crisis interpreter, a volunteer. The second challenge is for us, it's going to be really, really challenging to keep this fragile balance between quality, which is presented in the form of certified interpreters, and these ad hoc volunteer crisis interpreters, because we are also afraid that public service providers will now see how easily these can be deployed, but also the cost. Let us be honest, the volunteers are paid at a different rate than certified interpreters. So it's going to be very challenging to convince them why there is still a need for certified interpreters, which have a higher wage, a higher honorarium, and at the same time to keep the quality as criterion number one, as a standard. Which is why our trainings would be super interesting for public service providers, because we often also have a volunteer that they can practice speaking with. And it is only then that they realize how challenging it is to interpret, because most of them have no clue until they see it in real life, in a role play or in a setting that has been created especially for the training. Which is why it's a pity that we cannot organize these trainings for all public service providers that are now in contact with these crisis interpreters. So these are two big challenges, but hopefully we can take some conclusions to the next level of this game.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course, there's always the challenge of really identifying exhaustively the public services and public service providers that can make use and indeed make use one way or another of interpreters or of language mediators or what have you. Perhaps a question that came to mind as you were discussing this, the idea indeed of will public service providers perhaps simply go back to what is most convenient to them and most cost efficient? Is it somehow comparable to the whole situation of translation technology, whereby what we're hearing from the translation sector to a large extent these days is there's never been as much translation work as there is now, simply because everyone's translating. You've got translation tools readily available through Google Translate and DeepL, and everyone knows that this is not perfect, but it makes do. But if it really matters, if it really comes down to money making, for instance, or to human rights in terms of public services, we will always insist on having a certified interpreter, for instance, as they will go to a professional translator for translation. Is this something that makes sense, Elvira?
Das ist ja aus einer anderen Perspektive betrachtet genau
I think this is from a different perspective, but once again, this is the same balancing act that was described earlier. And this is this question, to what extent is there a kind of cannibalization, essentially? And to what extent is there an awareness among the specialists as regards who they can even turn to, who can work for them, what the legal framework is, what the financial repercussions are? And I think it's really valuable what Nina contributed in that specialists have to be trained to work together with interpreters, language mediators, to gain experience in a feel for what their role is. And I'm sure certain people simply haven't thought very much about what it means to work with interpreters if they haven't done so in the past. At the same time, I'm not sure if it was Nina or Katrijn actually, who said that we're right in the midst of a crisis. We can't really push a brand new project right now. We simply don't have the time. And Pascal said earlier that we're in a perpetual emergency. So all the same, here too, we do have to attempt this balancing act to introduce standards, to introduce structure, and not come up with excuses and say, oh, well, it's a crisis.
Indeed, it shouldn't lead to complacency. Pascal?
Yeah, well, it shouldn't lead to complacency. At the same time, we, as you indicated, Lieven, and the other speakers have mentioned as well, whether we want it or not, we are arriving into a new frame of thought. One, as far as certified interpreters go, which of course I am a fan, unless I'm mistaken, Nina, but if I see the figures, the success rate or the rate of interpreting activities by certified translators over the last years, as far as I'm aware, they're not being used lesser than before, in certain cases even more.
Yes.
But not enough of them are available. And that's the truth as well. And as I've said earlier, you cannot make them appear by magic. It takes training, it takes time. So I'm rather in favor of, not a big fan, but I'm also pragmatic sometimes. I'm in favor of the world in between. The world in between that leads to certification. No, the standard should be the standard. Certification, then post-certification if possible, but at least certification. And anything else should be developed in such a way that it leads, or at least can lead, towards certification. And that where the road towards certification by those candidates that are in those other programs is stimulated. For example, by means of an income, which is not a mere voluntary contribution, but a genuine, if not, public service interpreters usually won't become wealthy and become part of the top 1% of the wealthiest in the world, but at least a decent income. And then there's a world in between, which I've mentioned. We've been talking about those crisis interpreters, a program developed from a stronger program, which is the program for language assistance, which is I've referred to it earlier, a research-based program, research that we've done in collaboration with University of Ghent. So you could say they're the basic stepping stone, but then I've mentioned the other approaches that we're adopting now, where our Module 1 trainees get into the field, start to work after their intensified Module 1, but are coached in the meantime, do interpreting exercises in parallel, and then continue with the Module 2 program, etc. And there are a number of deviations from that. But I think we have arrived in a landscape in which we have to adapt a little bit to reality and not go for a mere solely one product certification. Is it, and there's nothing else. What we have to, and we have in fact, evolved towards a model which is a growth model. But we should never allow ourselves to drop that standard towards which one is growing to, which is a certification. And that certification, or the standard that is below it, should be shared by all of us, or at least at a European scale. And that's what the project, Katrijn, is about, isn't it, in the end?
Yes, thank you for this this nice overview sketch of the current landscape and landscape to be, Pascal. I hadn't expected any less of you, obviously. I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. We had a 1-hour session allocated to us, and our time is up. Let me perhaps conclude by, first of all, indicating that what we've seen is that yes, there is a crisis, but we have stepped up to the plate. Many of us, many public service interpreters, translators, providers, accreditation centers, etc. They've all done their utmost to make the best of it. And as always, perhaps from a crisis, we can learn something. We can seize the momentum that has arisen from this crisis. But as Pascal says, perhaps this is a growth model, but with growth models also come challenges, because you can't have things grow in every possible direction. Before you know it, you've got outgrowths of all kinds, and you need to trim them down again. And that's enough of that metaphor now. But in any case, I think this is absolutely, this basically sums up where we find ourselves today with PSIT in Europe. This is obviously something that we from ENPSIT will be monitoring very, very closely, and will try to fortify our network in order to help to guide this growth model into the right direction. For now, let me thank our panelists wholeheartedly for their contribution, Nina, Katrijn, Elvira, Pascal, and of course also our interpreter, who made it much easier for Elvira as well as for all of us to follow this panel debate. Thank you to all people in the audience for joining us today, for giving us our time, and let's stay in touch. Bye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.